The idea of overthrowing Castro's government emerged within the CIA in early 1960. Founded in 1947 by the National Security Act, the CIA was a product of the Cold War, having been designed to counter the espionage activities of the Soviet Union's own national security agency, the KGB. As the perceived threat of international communism grew larger, the CIA expanded its activities to undertake covert economic, political, and military activities that would advance causes favorable to U.S. interests, often resulting in brutal dictatorships that favored U.S. interests. In April 1960, the CIA began to recruit anti-Castro Cuban exiles in the Miami area. Until July 1960, assessment and training was carried out on Usepa Island and at various other facilities in South Florida, such as Homestead Air Force Base. Specialist guerrilla training took place at Fort Gulick and Fort Clayton in Panama. The force that became Brigade 2506 started with 28 men, who initially were told that their training was being paid for by an anonymous Cuban millionaire émigré, but the recruits soon guessed who was paying the bills, calling their supposed anonymous benefactor Uncle Sam, and the pretense was dropped. The overall leader was Dr. Manuel Artime, while the military leader was José Pepe Pérez San Roman, a former Cuban National Army officer imprisoned under both Batista and Castro. For the increasing number of recruits, infantry training was carried out at a CIA-run base codenamed JM-Trax. The base was on the Pacific coast of Guatemala between Quetzaltenango and Retalhuleu, in the Helvetia coffee plantation. On January 28, 1961, Kennedy was briefed, together with all the major departments, on the latest plan, codenamed Operation Pluto, which involved 1,000 men landed in a ship-borne invasion at Trinidad, Cuba, about 270 kilometers, 170 miles southeast of Havana, at the foothills of the Escambray Mountains in Sancti Spiritus Province. Kennedy authorized the active departments to continue and to report progress. Trinidad had good port facilities, it was closer to many existing counter-revolutionary activities, and it offered an escape route into the Escambray Mountains. From June to September 1960, the most time-consuming task was the acquisition of the aircraft to be used in the invasion. The anti-Castro effort depended on the success of these aircraft. Although models such as the Curtiss C-46 Commando and Douglas C-54 Skymaster were to be used for airdrops and bomb drops as well as for infiltration and exfiltration, they were looking for an aircraft that could perform tactical strikes. The two models that were going to be decided on were the Navy's Douglas AD-5 Skyraider or the Air Force's light bomber, the Douglas B-26 Invader. The AD-5 was readily available and ready for the Navy to train pilots, and in a meeting among a special group in the office of the Deputy Director of the CIA, the AD-5 was approved and decided upon. After a cost-benefit analysis, word was sent that the AD-5 plan would be abandoned and the B-26 would take its place. 143. Under cover of darkness, the invasion fleet set sail from Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua and headed towards the Bay of Pigs on the night of April 14th. After unloading the attack planes in Norfolk Naval Base and taking on prodigious quantities of food and supplies sufficient for the 7 weeks at sea to come, the crew knew from the hasty camouflage of the ship and aircraft identifying numbers that a secret mission was on hand. At midnight on April 17, 1961, the two LCIs Blagger and Barbara J., each with a CIA operations officer and an underwater demolition team of 5 frogmen, entered the Bay of Pigs. They headed a force of 4 transport ships, Houston, Rio Escondido, Caribe and Atlantico, carrying about 1,400 Cuban exile ground troops of Brigade 2506, plus the brigade's M41 tanks and other vehicles in the landing craft. At about 1 o'clock, Blagger, as the battlefield command ship, directed the principal landing at Playa Giron, codenamed Blue Beach, led by the frogmen in rubber boats followed by troops from Caribe in small aluminum boats, then the LCVPs and LCUs with the M41 tanks. Barbara J., leading Houston, similarly landed troops 35 kilometers further northwest at Playa Larga. The Cuban regime planned to strike the brigadistas at Playa Larga first as they were inland before turning on the brigadistas at Giron at sea. Castro departed personally to lead his forces into battle against the brigadistas. At daybreak around 6:30, 3 FAR Sea Furies, 1 B-26 bomber and 2 T-33s started attacking those CEF ships still unloading troops. At about 6:50, south of Playa Larga, Houston was damaged by several bombs and rockets from a Sea Fury and AT-33, and about 2 hours later Captain Luis Morse intentionally beached it on the western side of the bay. About 270 troops had been unloaded, but about 180 survivors who struggled ashore were incapable of taking part in further action because of the loss of most of their weapons and equipment. The loss of Houston was a great blow to the brigadistas as that ship was carrying much of the medical supplies, which meant that wounded brigadistas had to make do with inadequate medical care. At about 7 o'clock, 2 FAL B-26s attacked and sank the Cuban Navy patrol escort ship El Bayer at Nueva Gerona on the Isle of Pines. The final toll for Cuban armed forces during the conflict was 176 killed in action. This figure includes only the Cuban army, and it is estimated that about 2,000 militiamen were killed or wounded during the fighting. 5 other Cuban forces casualties were between 500 and 4,000, killed, wounded or missing. The airfield attacks on April 15 left 7 Cubans dead and 53 wounded. On April 19, at least 7 Cubans plus 2 CIA-hired U.S. citizens, Angus K. McNair and Howard F. Anderson, were executed in Pinar del Rio province, after a 2-day trial. On April 20, Humberto Sori Marin was executed at La Cabana, having been arrested on March 18 following infiltration into Cuba with 14 tons of explosives. His fellow conspirators Rogelio González Corzo, alias Francisco Gutierrez, Rafael Diaz Hanscom, Eufemio Fernandez, Arturo Hernandez Telehec and Manuel Lorenzo Puig Meyer were also executed. Between April and October 1961, hundreds of executions took place in response to the invasion. They took place at various prisons, including the Fortaleza de la Cabana and Morro Castle, for infiltration team leaders Antonio Diaz-Poe and Raimundo E. Lopez, as well as underground students Virgilio Campaneria, Alberto Tapia Ruano, and more than 100 other insurgents were executed. The failed invasion severely embarrassed the Kennedy administration and made Castro wary of future U.S. intervention in Cuba. On April 21, in a State Department press conference, Kennedy said, "There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan." Further statements, detailed discussions, are not to conceal responsibility because I'm the responsible officer of the government. The invasion's failure initiated Operation Mongoose to destabilize Cuba. 200. Later, Kennedy told Khrushchev that the Bay of Pigs invasion was a mistake. The aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion and events involving Cuba that followed caused the U.S. to feel threatened by its neighbor. Prior to the events at Playa Girón, the U.S. government imposed sanctions that limited trade with Cuba. An article appearing in the New York Times dated January 6, 1960 called trade with Cuba too risky. About 6 months later, in July 1960, the U.S. reduced the import quota of Cuban sugar, leaving the U.S. no choice but to maintain its sugar needs from other sources. Immediately following the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Kennedy administration considered a complete embargo. 5 months later, the president was authorized to do. Many who fought for the CIA in the conflict remained loyal to the USA after the event. Some Bay of Pigs veterans became officers in the U.S. Army in the Vietnam War, including 6 colonels, 19 lieutenant colonels, 9 majors, and 29 captains. By March 2007, about half of the brigade had died. In the end, many of Cuban exiles blamed the Kennedy administration for abandoning the troops and lack of support. The rest is history.